I'm gonna walk you through how I make reads to win the most amount of money playing live poker. We'll go through 5 hands and I'll show you just how many exploits you can make from a single showdown. Then I'll give you 10 quick hitting reads you can use at the table to instantaneously exploit your opponents. For context, I'm Marc Goone. I've won over 7 figures playing poker, and I make these videos to help you win more so you can climb past low stakes and hopefully join us one day at Hungry Horse where we can help you crush mid to high stakes and beyond. All right, let's jump right in. Read number 1, when our opponent snap calls the turn. All right, so let's say we see this hand go down at the table. Bobin is going to open in the cutoff here. We're just gonna fold on the button. We're not involved in this hand. Villain is going to call in the big blind. Flop comes Jack 9 deuce. What do you know? Look at that sweet baby there. Villain's going to check it over. Bobin c-bets, villain calls. Villain is going to check over and flow on the turn. Bobin continues to double barrel here, and now villain snap calls. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't think about raising. He doesn't think about folding. He just puts in a very, very quick call here on this turn. Now the river is a blank, and the river goes check, check, and we see that villain flips over ace jack here, and he is good, and he scoops the pot. So what I'm taking away from this, when villain snap call, you can immediately take away the very top of their range, because if they did have a very, very strong hand, they would at least consider raising. So usually when villain snap call, they have hands that are going to be medium strength hands, like we saw in that last hand, or draws. So let's say we open queen 10 of clubs on the button here. Same villain's going to call in the big blind, Jack 9 deuce. We are going to c-bet. He is going to call. Now we go to a turn. On this nut changing turn, we think villain can have a lot of flushes. So we are going to continue betting small here with both our bluffs and our value. With our bluffs, because it's nice when villain raises off their strong hands right now and still continues with their weak stuff, which means we have a very profitable range to bluff on the river. And with our strong stuff, like flushes here, we would also want to bet small, because say we have ace queen of spades here. If we bet small, villain's going to raise off their smaller flushes, and they're also going to continue with a bunch of weak shit that's drawing dead that we can still get value from on the river. We go $30 into 82, and now villain is going to snap call. So what type of hands are they going to have when they snap call? Maybe they could have some draws like king queen with the king of spades. Maybe they could have some top pair like ace jack or king jack. All of that is reasonable, but we just know they're not going to have a flush here. When we have a bluff here, we can go very, very big to just get them to fold king jack or queen jack or ace jack. And if we did have value, if we did get to this river with ace queen of spades or something like that, we could also use that to advantage, knowing that the best hand our opponent has is probably going to be a hand like ace jack. We probably want to go small to entice them to call. This is how to exploit opponents when you see them snap call. We are going to go absolutely massive on this river, and we are going to get the fold. Read number 2. Let's say we see an opponent check back top pair on a wet board. Bobon this time is going to open from the hijack. Villain's going to call on the button. Flop comes Jack 9 deuce. Bobin is going to check it over, and villain is going to check back. Turn is a blank. Bobin bets here for value. The villain calls. Now on the river, Bobin again bets for value, just figuring he's got the best hand here with pocket tens, and villain calls on this river and shows ace jack. So how do we exploit opponents who are going to check back hands as strong as top pair good kicker, even on wet boards? All right, adjustment number 1. Let's say we open pocket kings here. Same villain calls on the button who checked back top pair, top kicker in the last hand. We go to a flop, Jack 9 deuce. And as you know, my MO out of position is usually to check my entire range in single raise pots, because I believe opponents in general overstab, telegraph their hand strength with their bet sizing, and do not protect their checking range. But against a player who's going to check back top pair good kicker, even on wet boards, here is the first adjustment I would make. I would not be range checking. I would just start betting myself and putting in money much more often, specifically when I have very good hands here like pocket kings. We just want to start putting them in the blender right away, because they're not going to fold if we just go bet, bet, bet with pocket kings here. If they have a hand like ace jack, I would just come out and bet pocket kings myself. Adjustment number 2, I would still be checking over to our opponent quite often when we have draws or semi bluffs here, because if our opponent checks back, well, we just get to realize for free. And if our opponent bets, well, let's talk about that now. So we open queen 10 in the cutoff here. Opponent's going to call on the button. Flop comes Jack 9 deuce here. We check it over, and now our opponent is going to bet. We know this type of opponent is going to be checking back hands like ace jack or queen jack at a decent frequency here. So if we've seen them do that before, when they bet, what do they mostly have? They're going to have a more polarized range, meaning they're going to have more nuts or air type hands. So I would just be check raising quite a bit here, and I would just be check raising a relatively small size, and we can just get them to fold the air, put a lot of pressure on the draws, and sure, we run into some strong hands very occasionally, so I would just be check raising our draws and our semi-bluffs at a very, very high frequency here on the flop when villain does stab. And next here, if villain does check back the flop, I think a big mistake a lot of live players make here is getting to this turn with queen high and being like, oh, I have to start a bet now. Well, what's going to happen if we just bet the turn and bet the river? The reason they check back with ace jack or king jack on the flop is to pot control, so they can call no matter what sizes you bet on the turn or the river. So I would practice delayed gratification here. If the flop does go check check, I would put in one more check. Now our opponent's almost always going to bet when they have a hand like ace jack, king jack, jack 10, something like that. And when they bet, now we can go for that max fold equity line, which is a huge check raise on the turn. And if villain calls, well, we can make them play for all the money on the river. Remember, the reason they're checking back the flop is because they don't necessarily want to play for all the money. So if we are going to run the bluff, let's run the line with the max fold equity, put them in those uncomfortable positions, and take the line which gets ace jack, king jack, queen jack to fold. All right, guys, real quick, if you're enjoying the video, all I ask, please hit that subscribe button. It lets the YouTube algorithm know that this is the type of content you enjoy. I will make more videos just like this one if you hit that subscribe button. Thank you, guys. Have a gentle day. Read number 3. When we see our opponent cold call a 3-bet. All right, let's say we see this hand go down at our friendly 2-5 table. Boban's going to open it up here in the hijack. The cutoff is going to 3-bet, and now we see villain cold call in the big blind here. Goes to a flop, ace high, and this just checks through. A queen on the turn. Villain's going to come out and bet big here, and now the original 3-better is going to call. We go to the river, villain checks, and now the original 3-better is just going to put in the money. Villain is going to call, and we see villain end up here with ace king. So how can we exploit a player who is cold calling 3-bets with hands like ace king? The number one exploit I would make is just 4-betting much, much wider. Now, the thing I will say, it very much depends on your opponent if you're just going to widen that range by including just more bluffs, or you're just going to go much, much thinner for value with your 4-bets. And let's say we open the button with a hand like ace 6, small blind is going to 3-bet, and the villain in the big blind is going to cold call. If villain is the type of player who just doesn't want to play for all the money with hands like jacks, queens, ace king, and you are relatively deep, I would just be putting in a ton of 4-bet bluffs here with hands like ace 6 suited, king 8 suited. If villain is the type of opponent who is going to just call it off when they have ace king or queens or jacks, then I would just start going thinner. And in this scenario, I would take ace king suited, I would take ace king off, I would take pocket queens, and I would just always be putting in the 4-bet here. The other exploit I think is the most important one, and it's looking at the other side of the coin. So we know villain's going to start cold calling with hands like ace king and presumably hands like jacks and queens. So let's say we open kings on the button here. We're going to get 3-bet in the small blind, and now the same villain who cold called with ace king is going to put in the cold 4-bet in the big blind. If they are cold calling with hands like ace king, pocket queens, what does that mean when they cold 4-bet? They just have aces or kings. Right? They just have aces or kings. So here is how to exploit this player. When we have a hand like kings here, when we have a hand like queens here, we should just be folding. And this is one of those examples of how you can get away from pocket kings pre-flop. If you've seen this guy cold call with ace king or queens, when they cold 4-bet, they don't have ace king or queens, right? This is just going to be aces and kings. And when we have kings, it makes it a lot more likely that they have aces. So this would be one of the spots where I would fold pocket kings. All right, read number 4. When we see our opponent check from out of position with a hand as strong as top pair, top kicker. All right, let's say we see this hand go down at the table. Villain is going to open it up in the hijack. Boban is going to call. We are getting out of the way. We are not in this hand. Villain is going to c-bet. Boban is going to call. Now on the turn, villain is going to double barrel for a big size. Boban is going to call. We go to a river, and now villain checks. And at this point, Boban takes the bait. He is going to bet for about 2/3 pot, and villain snaps it off and shows up here with ace jack. So how do we exploit this type of player who is going to check on rivers from out of position with hands as strong as top pair, top kicker? First, let's look at the spot when we have value. So let's say again, villain is going to open. This time we are the hero in the hand. We call jack 9 deuce. Villain c-bets. We are going to call with top pair, top kicker. Turn is a 4, bringing in a backdoor flush draw. Villain's going to double. We call. Now the river is a 3, and villain checks it over. So when we have ace jack here, it would be a disaster for us to bet 150 or 200 here, right? When villain checks this river, they are not planning on folding unless you put in an absolutely monstrous size bet. So this is a spot to get greedy. We've seen villain check this spot with a hand like ace jack, so they could certainly have hands like king jack or queen jack or jack 10 that bet the flop, bet the turn big, and now check the river when all the draws brick to check call. I would just be going absolutely massive. So when villain checks it over to us, I go 400, just knowing that villain gets here with a lot of hands like king jack, queen jack that aren't planning on check folding. We get called, and we win a nice little pot. I also want to talk about the corollary here. What does this mean when villain bets the river? So let's say we we play this exact same hand, except we have queen 10. Villain bets the flop, we call. Villain double barrels a turn, we call. And now villain bets the river. What does this mean? Well, it's going to mean the villain is very polarized, meaning they have in this spot either nuts or air. They're not going to be doing this with hands like ace jack, king jack, hands like that. So when they get to the spot, they either have two pair, a set, or air. And if we get to the spot with a hand like queen high that doesn't beat a lot of their air, say we're losing to their ace high flush draws, their king high flush draws, etc. One cool thing we could do in the spot when we get here with the bluff is we could just click it. We could literally min raise in this spot because we can get villain to fold all of their ace high flush draws, all of their king high flush draws. Villain's just going to be more heavily weighted towards those type of hands because we know villain isn't going to be betting hands like single pair in the spot. One of the things I like to do when a villain is repping a polar range, my bluffs like to raise very, very small. If we had queen 10 here, we just raise very, very small because their air is going to fold if we breathe on this pot. And if we got here somehow with a hand like 5, 6 of spades, right? If we got here with the nuts, I would just be going all in because I don't think villain is folding a hand like pocket deuces, jack 9 suited, pocket 9s. If they get here with a set or two pair, but if they get here with a hand like ace high or king high, they are folding to a min raise. So our bluffs in the spot when villain's polar wants to just click it, and our value in the spot wants to put in all of the money. So with queen 10 here, we can just click it and get villain to fold their ace and king highs. And one last note, if we did get to this river with a hand like ace 10 of spades or something like that, I would be very, very tempted to consider calling in some instances when we beat a lot of villain's bluffs. The only reason I'm raising with a hand like queen 10 is because we lose to most of villain's bluffs. They're really repping two pair plus or air, and when we have a hand like ace 10 of spades here in the spot, we beat all of their air. So when we know villain is repping a very, very polar range on the river, I would be inclined to call pretty light. Read number 5, when we see a player check call with a set on a wet board. All right, let's say we see this hand go down. Bobin is going to open from the cutoff. We've seen a lot of tangling between Bobin and the villain. So villain's going to check it over. Bobin's going to c-bet. Villain's going to check call. We go to a turn. Villain is going to check. Bobin is going to double barrel. Now villain's going to put in the check raise. Bobin's going to call. Villain is going to bet big once again when the flush comes in on the board pairs. Bobin is going to call, and look at that. Villain has a full house, and they just check called on the flop with a set on a wet board. And usually villains are going to fast play strong hands like sets and two pair on very wet boards. So how do we exploit this when a villain is going to trap some of their very strong hands even on wet boards? All right, let me show you. Let's say we have pocket 9s this time. We open the button. Villain's going to call in the big blind, jack 9 deuce. What do you know? We flop middle set. We are going to c-bet on the flop. You know my MO at this point is to use the size on the flop where they raise their strong shit and call it their weak shit, usually around half pot in a single raise pot. So that's what we go. Villain is going to check call. Now the turn is a blank, and on turns, usually the question I ask is, are they capped? And if yes, I bet very, very big. And if no, I bet very, very small. So usually when villains are capped and the hands you're going to have in this spot are going to be top pair, good kicker, and a bunch of draws, I like to go very, very big. But if we are playing against a villain who is going to trap sets on the flop, then in this scenario, no, they are not capped. They can still have hands like jack 9 or pocket deuces, hands like that. So in that scenario, I would want to go small again on the turn to give them another chance to put in the raise. The reason why we want to go with a smaller size on the turn, if villain does have a hand that we cooler like jack 9 or pocket deuces, well, now they're going to raise on the turn, and we can also get them to call with a bunch of their weak shit as well by choosing a smaller size here with pocket 9s. We are going to go 50, just over half pot, and now villain is going to wake up and put in the big check raise on the turn. And as we've seen, when villain check calls the flop and check raises the turn, they're going to have a strong hand. This is just going to be hands like jack 9 or pocket deuces, or even hands like pocket 4s with a spade that called the flop. This is just going to be sets in two pair. So when we can cooler most of that range, would we ever want to bet 3-bet here as a bluff? No. Never. We wouldn't want to bet 3-bet here as a bluff because we're just never getting folds. Villain has a very strong range. So when we end up here with pocket 9s, villain's not folding a hand like pocket deuces. Villain's not folding a hand like jack 9. So let's just go all in. We get called, river is a blank, and we win a nice little pot. All right, finally, I want to leave you with 10 quick hitters. If you see a player at your table do one of these 10 things, you can instantaneously start making these exploits. Let's go. Number 1, if a player buys in for less than the max in a cap game, this is almost always not going to be a pro. It's going to be a recreational player or a fish. Treat them as such. Go for the hard exploits right away. Number 2, if a player is choosing to sit out bomb pots, this is usually going to be a more conservative player. It means they're not going to be on the gambly side. When they bet, they are probably going to be under bluffing, and they are not going to be a player who's usually going to want to play for all of the money with marginal hands. Number 3, if you see a player limp call, this is almost always going to be a recreational player or a fish, and what this means is more interesting when they raise than when they limp, because if they're limping a bunch, it just means they're limping all of the bottom and middle of their range. So when they raise first in, when they open raise pre-flop, it means they're just going to have a very, very, very strong range. So be careful 3-betting this player when they come in for an open raise, because a lot of their bullshit hands just go in the limp range. Number 4, when you see a player who goes for the limp raise pre-flop, again, this is going to be a recreational player or a fish. What this also means when you see this player open, well, what type of hands are they limp raising? Usually their very strongest hands, pocket aces, pocket kings, pocket queens. So when they open, they just don't have the very, very top of their range. So you can just 3-bet this player when they open with impunity, knowing they most likely don't have aces or kings, particularly when they open from early position, because those are the hands they like to go for the limp raise. Number 5, if you see a player vary their open sizing, say they are opening usually to 4 or 5x, and then they open to 8 or 9x, and they show down a hand like pocket 10s or pocket jacks. This is very, very common. So one of the things you can do when they open to this very, very large size, of course, the easy adjustment is just fold almost everything when they're opening to this ridiculous size. But if you do have a hand like queens, kings, aces, ace king suited, and you see this type of player open to 8x, do not 3-bet to 3 or 4x, right? Do not 3-bet to the standard size. When they open to this size, they are not planning on open folding. They just have a strong hand like 9s, 10s, jacks, etc. They are not planning on folding. So if you have a hand that can beat that range, put in a monster 3-bet. I'm talking 6, 7, 8x, whatever ridiculous size you can use, however you can get the most money in the pot. They're announcing, telling you, hey sir, I am not going to fold this hand. Okay, so if you can beat that hand, put in way more money. Number 6, if you see a player calling a 3-bet way too wide out of position with hands like ace-10 offsuit or king-jack offsuit, the adjustment you want to make here is just 3-bet them very, very linearly and use much larger sizes when you 3-bet them pre-flop. Number 7, if you see a player buy in with cash instead of chips or a player's bank, it is more likely than not that they're going to be a recreational player or a fish than a pro. Number 8, the inverse to that, if you see a player buy in with chips or a player's bank or a box, it is more likely than not that they are going to be a pro than a recreational player. Number 9, if you see a player line up all of their chips so all of the sides are perfectly aligned, this is going to be a player who by definition is just not getting involved much. Their chips aren't going in and out of pots. They are probably going to be more conservative. They are going to be under bluffing. They do not want to play for all the money, most likely. Finally, number 10, if you have a player who refuses to straddle when the rest of the table is doing it, again, this is going to be a player who's going to be more on the scared money side. They are not going to want to put in all the money with marginal hands. They are probably going to be under bluffing. All right, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video on how to make reads at the poker table and how to use those reads to exploit your opponents. Hopefully this skyrockets your win rate and turns you into one of the biggest boys possible. Thank you guys and have a gentle day.